Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing LA 92. LA 92 is a 2017 documentary about the racial tensions that erupted into riots in Los Angeles in 1992. At the core of the unrest was the acquittal of 4 white police officers who'd been caught on video savagely beating a black man, Rodney King. The relatively light sentencing of a shopkeeper who shot and killed an unarmed black girl who thought she was stealing also contributed to the unrest. The documentary explains these two contributing events, but also explores the city's decades-long history of discrimination and ill treatment of its black population. I came across LA 92 on the National Geographic channel, on their website. Basically, from a summary, what I gathered was that this was a documentary about the riots in LA in 1992, which to some degree it certainly is, but it's actually more than that. The documentary goes beyond just discussing the 92 LA riots to take a deeper look into the history of LA and the circumstances, really the atmosphere that led to the riots of 1992. So certainly it's about the riots, but it also spent a good deal of time, I would say maybe half of the documentary, discussing the various events and really the climate that led to this explosion in 1992. And so as a part of the documentary, it doesn't actually begin in 1992, but goes further back than that to the Watts riots of the 1960s. And then even before that, as it does touch on the circumstances that led to a lot of black people moving to LA from elsewhere in the country. So basically what you had was a good amount of the black people in LA came from the South, some as far as Mississippi, Louisiana, cities like New Orleans, those kinds of places. And really, as with those who migrated to other parts of the country from the South, they were fleeing the oppression of the South. So Jim Crow, black codes, all of these various facets of this system of inequality that black people were being forced to live under in the South. And the hope was that by leaving the South, going west, where there was seemingly this promise of equality, a promise of opportunity, a chance for a better life, moving to these new areas, it meant a different start for their children, for the generations beyond that. Unfortunately, that might have been the promise, that might have been the hope, but upon arriving in LA, as occurred in other parts of the country, the new arrivals found that while things were better in some ways, there were also problems. In this new environment, arriving in LA, it's like you might not have had the blatant racism or the same form of racism that you had in the South, but there was racism nonetheless. There was a system of oppression nonetheless. There were limitations and opportunities for black versus white people weren't the same. And so how is that equality, right? How that oppression was carried out might have differed, but it still existed. It was still a system under which black people had to live. And so there was this thing of fleeing the South in hopes of better opportunities, in hopes of a better environment to live, to raise one's children, but finding that many of the problems that you were fleeing in the South also existed out west in LA. So arriving in LA, many of these black transplants now found themselves having to contend with violence in the form of interactions with police, limited opportunities. In the 60s, up to the 60s, you would have jobs, but as time went by, you had to contend with job loss. Just these different factors, poverty being an issue, lack of jobs being an issue, police brutality, violence, police harassment. And so it's like, while it might not have been blatantly stated in laws, you still had this system of de facto segregation where LA Hollywood LA that we might think of, it exists for one group of people, but the reality of LA for black people was something very different. It's like LA has this, it's a place of dreams, the city of angels, hope, opportunity. What it promised and the reality was vastly different for a lot of black people. To move to the area, it's like their situation might have had some improvement from the South, but it wasn't a complete change. It wasn't the large overhaul and leap in opportunities that was hoped for. And so there was certainly some disappointment now with this arrival in LA. And a huge part of the problem is that this kind of de facto segregation, this thing of being pinned into too crowded neighborhoods, certain neighborhoods having limitations placed on you as far as where you could or could not go from a social standpoint, but also with regards to where you could live, where you could buy homes. And then even before we get to that point, the type of jobs that you could obtain, the type of schools that you or your children could attend. In having those limitations placed upon you, how far you could strive to progress, it was sort of a means of preserving the system, much as had existed in the South. You had the police. It might not have been written into law, but certainly you have this tendency and this oft-repeated occurrence of police officers brutalizing Black people, treating Black people like second-class citizens. This thing of there being a clear delineation, a core difference in how police handle white citizens versus how they handle Black citizens. And so in the beginning of the documentary, there are clips from back in like the 50s and 60s. The documentary actually begins with Black and white clips from back in the 50s and 60s. Black people coming into contact with the police, being manhandled, abused, harassed. And so you have these moments of negativity interacting with the police. And it really helps to drive home the point, especially as the documentary gets going and you begin to move into the present, into the 90s, that these injustices suffered by Black people wasn't a new thing. It wasn't a new occurrence. These things that were taking place in the 90s had been taking place for decades at that point. This thing of police harassment, police brutality, Black people being severely beaten for minor infractions. It had been going on for decades. It wasn't anything new. Really, the only difference, and I think what continues to be the difference, even into our present, as these instances of police brutality continue to occur, unfortunately not just in LA, but elsewhere around the country, is that the real difference is technology. That these things were occurring in the past, and the only real change is the increase in proliferation of video cameras, which then allowed for more of these incidents to be recorded. And so you look at it, it's unfortunate, but look back at history and you see this with negative things as well. This thing of, as well as positive, I guess, this thing of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Unfortunately, many of the problems that we're dealing with in the present, really, these are things that crop up every now and then, sort of on a cycle. These are problems that have been around for quite some time. And when I say quite some time, decades, if not centuries at this point. The brutalization of Black people has been endemic, really, since the start of this country, or shortly thereafter. And so while we're still having conversations about what needs to be done, changes that need to be brought about, how to overhaul the system, what can be done to fix these problems, the reality is that there's a very, I think especially by this point, clear understanding of what the problems are and what the solutions need to be. The difficulty is in actually having the change that needs to happen take place. The changes that need to occur, having them come about, having them become a reality. In recent years, I've done a few profiles of Black people who were among some of the first to move out to the West Coast. And this is dating back to the 1800s, right? They were heading west in search of opportunity. And many of the experiences that they had, or a shared thing, is that they were often treated like second-class citizens. It's like they started out on the East Coast in the South or the Midwest or something like that, and hoping to get away from that mistreatment, they arrived out west, especially at first when some of these places might not have been so populous. They wouldn't have to deal with racism and unfair and unequal treatment at the outset, along the lines of what they had to deal with in the South, until people from the East and other parts of the country eventually made their way out west and brought some of those prevailing attitudes with them. And so as part of that, you'd have this thing of, not so much to refer to the Bible itself or to religion, but more so this story of people in search of a promised land, a people in search of a haven, a place of safety, moving from place to place. And it's like by the time you get settled in one place, and this seems like it might be a good spot, people move into the area and you're now forced to flee once again. You're constantly having to pick up and move elsewhere, trying to escape this ever-encroaching system of oppression. Because the problem isn't really the location. The problem is the people. As people move from one place to another, as people have experienced this system of inequality, and especially when they benefit from it, and they believe they have a right to it, when they move from one place to another, they bring these attitudes with them. They bring those expectations with them. And so what you end up having is, as was the case in the South, people moving from the South to the Midwest or, from the colonial states out West, from the South to the North, the Midwest, wherever it is. These places that were supposed to be fresh and new, offering a chance, like a fresh start, they would bring their old beliefs with them to these new areas and pollute them as well. So it's like basically you've moved from one coast to another, and landing at the Pacific, there's really nowhere else for you to go. And so it's like you're now in LA having to deal with much of the same problems that either you yourself were dealing with or your ancestors were dealing with that motivated them to flee the South. And so in looking back at that, looking back at the 50s and the 60s, we see where you now have Black people living in LA and they're having to contend with being mistreated. Simple things like the police stopping them for no reason. And it speaks of this thing of unjustified stops, which continues to be a problem now. A few years ago in New York, you had the stop and frisk program. You had reasonable suspicion, where the police are being granted the power and authority to stop people because they look suspicious. Not because they're committing a crime or anything along those lines, but simply because they look suspicious. And this fails to take into consideration the reality that for many, just a person being Black, your state of Blackness, be that person a man, woman, or child, is cause for concern. It's cause for suspicion and distrust. You really have to ask the question of, is it really fair or reasonable to endow members of law enforcement with this kind of leeway, where without proof of a crime, without witnessing the commission of a crime, that they're given pretty much carte blanche, discretion to stop and search people, questioning them about where they're going, what they're doing, who they are, where they're from, these kinds of questions. And it's like, when you look at it through that lens, right, through people's perspective, taking into account the history of this country, the reality that people's perspectives are very much skewed by stereotypes, prejudice, and things like that, how fair is it to give members of law enforcement such leeway, especially when it's applied to one group of people, but certainly not with another? So branching off from that, it's like, this was a problem even back in the 50s and 60s. Black people being treated as less than human. I don't even want to say children, because I don't think it's right to treat children in this way. But this kind of paternalistic attitude of, I have a right as a police officer, which really branches off from having a right as a white person within the society to stop you, to speak to you however, like pretty much to treat you as I want to, as I see fit, to utilize violence to control you. It's like, I don't have to be mindful of you. I don't have to consider your humanity. When dealing with you, it's acceptable for me to treat you however I feel, right? I could use my discretion to treat you as I see fit. So you have this thing where it becomes ingrained over time. It becomes social practice where treating Black people as second-class citizens, even when not codified into law, it becomes common practice, right? You have officers using blatantly racist language, mistreating Black people to the degree that you had in the South, right? where you can beat Black people. Here's this distinct written set of rules that allows you to mistreat Black people, but it becomes codified as well with social practice. And so it's like within the justice system, that kind of treatment is deemed acceptable. Excuses are made for it. And we know this because it's a practice that you see carried out over decades, generations really. So basically what we see is there are like countless examples at the beginning of the documentary, black and white photos, video clips of Black people being mistreated, manhandled really by the police. And as the documentary then moves from the 60s into the present towards the early 90s, having set the stage really provided an understanding and explanation of the environment. It then moved into the present, which would be like the early 90s, where basically you have, back in the 60s, things eventually reached a boiling point and you had a series of riots then. And you have this happening again in the early 90s, where pretty much people got tired of this treatment and decided to vent that frustration, that anger, the host of feelings and emotions to release that tension. And as occurred in the 60s, where you had riots in Watts, and then also other parts of the country, you then in the 60s and then later in the 90s again had riots breaking out. But it's telling, right? When we discuss riots, something that I've come to realize or I've become aware of in reading about the history of racism and this system of oppression is just Black history in general, right? And in America, around the world, but especially within America, is that, especially in recent times, when we discuss these uprisings, if you will, right? This kind of powder keg exploding. There's these questions about rioting and Black rage and anger, things like that. And it actually reminds me of the book that I read, which was called White Rage, right? But beyond that, it's like these books that I've read were up until maybe the 50s or maybe the 60s or so, you had riots that occurred in cities across America prior to that, right? You would have these eruptions every now and then around the country. But the difference with those, and why we don't really hear about them, is that back then, the ones that caused these riots were white people, whereas often, with Black people, they're giving vent to frustration, right? Being held down in poverty, being ill-treated, right? The various social issues of the day. But in the past, these riots and uprisings by white people were in response to the perception of Black people infringing on or pushing the boundaries of what was deemed acceptable for Black people. Black people essentially being viewed as stepping out of their place. And this feeling, this need to push back against progress, to push back against Black people, aspiring to move beyond these prescribed stations. Especially in recent years, it's always discussed where, riots are taking place, when there's looting, when there's destruction in areas. And the reality of it is nowadays when things like this happen, there's a call for peace. There's a call for calm. There's you hear it stressed on the news and elsewhere that this isn't the right way to be angry, or this isn't the right way to bring about change. And you know what, to some degree, I agree with that. In agitating for being treated as human beings, and in the past to not be lynched or to not be brutalized by the police or whatever other injustice you're facing, to not have your property be stolen away. It's like you have Black people pushing back and fighting back against that reality as best as they could, while at the same time you had these white protests taking place where it was really a matter of them lamenting the loss of their sense of superiority. That generally doesn't factor into the conversation. This is a conversation that we don't have. This is a topic that we don't really discuss or touch on. And I find it really telling. Pretty much what you realize is that as we recall with other riots as occurred in the 60s, that usually it would be pinpointed as like one event that caused the riot. But typically that's not the case. And we see that here. The beating of Rodney King was more so the spark, right? But the powder keg was there, and arguably the fuse had been lit and had been burning. It's sort of like, more accurately, like the Rodney King beating and the acquittal of the officers was sort of like pouring gasoline on the flame more than anything, right? This anger had been building for quite some time. And the last time it spilled over was back in the 60s. But you basically had a continuation of those same factors, and the beating of Rodney King, the killing of Latasha Harkins. It's like they were contributing factors. It was part of this continued thing of the lives of Black people within this community being taken for granted. This idea that Black people could be beaten, they could be murdered, and it was okay. That you as a police officer could use racist language to refer to a Black person, that you could use excessive force, and dealing with a Black person that you'd apprehended, regardless of whatever the crime is. But that even upon stopping this individual, pulling him over, that wasn't enough. Having him on the ground where you could easily put him in handcuffs and take him to prison, you feel as though you have the right for multiple officers to attack him with nightsticks, to stomp on him, and then go on about your day. It's like it shows you just how undervalued Black lives are. And so it's like that you can be a young girl who walks into a store to purchase juice. You have the money in your hand. And because an individual has, I don't know if it's stereotypes about Black people in her mind, or even if it might have been past experiences with individuals who had stolen from the store. But you walking into the store and being Black, could lead to her pulling out a gun. Latasha wasn't a physical threat. She wasn't in any kind of physical danger. She really this is the shopkeeper, instigated the conflict. That it's acceptable to pull out your firearm and shoot this young girl in the head. Go on trial, and when you go to court, the judge considers you to not be a danger to society. Completely ignoring the fact that this is an individual who, when there was no real provocation, when she wasn't in any real physical danger, went above and beyond defending herself, to kill someone over a bottle of juice. That she felt she could end the life of this child over what was maybe, I don't even know how much juice costs, like a $2 bottle of juice, if that. Because whether or not she was stealing the juice, there was no imminent threat. There was no danger. It's not like she was beating you to death or something like that should have warranted shooting her. And so it's like, there's no real explanation as to why you resorted to lethal violence. There was no reason for you to pull out a gun and shoot this person, especially when you were the aggressor. And so it's like, with that in mind, I don't understand how it then becomes that you view this person as not being a danger to society. This is a person with access to a gun. And it's like, even in instances where your life is not in danger, you feel it acceptable to pull out your gun and shoot at someone. Your life is under no threat. Your property isn't under threat. You as a person, if that's acceptable, what then is the standard for self-defense? It means that someone else having preconceived notions about you, having prejudicial ideas about you or your ethnic group or whatnot, feeling threatened just by your very presence, then it gives them carte blanche, right? Where they can kill you and get away with it. It's like, when you look at this woman, she owned a store. Fine. Maybe she had problems with people stealing from the store before. Or maybe she had been robbed before. Whatever the case might be. But the reality is that this specific individual was not a threat to you. This specific individual was not stealing from you. This specific individual did not she didn't deserve to be executed, because that's basically what it was. Your response, your handling of this situation proves, if anything, that you're not fit to own a gun because you're trigger happy. And yes, you are, by virtue of that, a danger to society. Because it's like, if you would have such a strong reaction to this individual who was not a threat, who's to say that you wouldn't do something like this to someone else? How does that seem? The level of violence just seems unwarranted. And so it's like from there, you just have this, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? This boiling over, adding insult to injury and injury to insult, where now people are frustrated, they're angry, and it boiled over and led to the riots. And I'm not saying that the things that took place were right. You know, the response to being a victim of violence and oppression isn't that you then become violent and oppressive in turn, right? I don't think that's the answer. It's certainly not, but I understand the frustration. I understand the lashing out. And so with that, I just thought it was a really interesting documentary. And I felt the way that the filmmakers approached it, not just focusing on the riots itself, but really the events that led to them, was really informative and eye-opening. It's a more holistic view of what took place. And the unfortunate thing about it is, as I mentioned, by this point, we have a very clear understanding of why these riots take place. It's the same problems over and over. These problems and issues have been around dating back to, we've been officially aware of these problems and issues dating back to at least the 50s, 60s, if not earlier. The issues that contributed to them have been around really for far longer than that. And it's like, I get annoyed, right? In recent years, like in 2020, in the years before that, when you had similar riots, you have this question of, what led to this? And the reality is people are angry, people are frustrated. When you have these riots, when you have these uprisings, in the immediate aftermath, there's a call to get to the bottom of this, to understand what needs to change, this, that, and the third. But the reality is that, as is evidence from the past, nothing ever really changes. The problems that we're dealing with now that brought about the whole Black Lives Matter movement and these various riots and whatnot of 2020 and in the, surrounding years, is that the problems are very well documented. We know what the contributing factors are. The problem is just that change is not coming about. Real and meaningful change is not occurring. And it's like, when you think about it, back in the 50s or 60s, when you had these riots, right, specifically the riots in Watts, it was due to police brutality, right? People being tired of it. And it's like, when you think back to the riots of the 50s and 60s, really the 60s, right, around the country, but specifically the riots in Watts, they occurred in part due to police brutality, right? People being tired of it. And so you have this occurring again, 30 or so years later in the 90s? It's like another 30 or so years later in the 2010s or so, you have more riots. It's like, we need to stop talking about the changes that need to happen. Politicians making promises about things that need to happen. It's kind of grasping at straws here, right? I guess at least police officers and police commissioners are more willing. Politicians are now more willing, I guess, to acknowledge wrongdoing rather than excusing it. But there's still this thing of officers pretty much getting away with murdering Black people, unless it's especially egregious. Officers still feel as though they have the right, that they're endowed with the right by virtue of their position to mistreat Black people, to brutalize Black people. And it's like, I honestly get tired of having these conversations over and over again, or hearing these conversations over and over again. But, putting that aside, the documentary is actually really incredible. I think if you looked into Black history, if you've looked into police brutality or any of these other related social issues, you won't necessarily learn anything new here. But it does help to give some perspective, to kind of zoom in on the problems, to give a more multifaceted and full understanding of the issues that were taking place in LA specifically, and the riots that occurred as a result. And so with that, I highly recommend LA 92. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.